Hello. In this part of the tutorial, we're going to take a look at a zSphere workflow from zSpheres to near complete sculpt. So we're going to start with the usual suspects. We start with 3 zSpheres in the center, and then we pull the limbs out. We looked at this in the previous zSphere primer. And keep in mind that I'm using zSpheres as mesh generators. So while in this case I go in and I put the actual bones in there, such as the knees and the elbows, that can change, and a lot of times it really just should change. Also keep in mind that the arms, or the hands in this case, are not going to be individual digits, but because the primary result of this is going to be a character, just a maquette, so to speak, I can get away with not worrying about fingers and just have the hands be these blocky shapes, because it'll be making some sort of hand gesture, either a clenched fist or something of that sort. So I've got everything positioned. This is pretty much exactly what I had in the zSphere primer. And now I'm going in with rotate, and I'm just giving it a little bit of contrapposto, bend the knee a touch, give him some character. Bend the arms, and since I don't have elbows in this case, it does add a few difficulties, and so it might be better if you're going to pose it to work with actual joints. But it's all plus and minuses. So here we're going to have the right arm in the right hand in front of him in some kind of clenched fist style, as though he's flexing his bicep. So notice with rotate on, it gets very sensitive. So I'm clicking with symmetry off. You have to turn symmetry off to use rotate in this way. But you just have to be very gingerly about it. So we're going to say make adaptive skin, and we're going to save this out, and there we've got our sculpt to start with. So this is again just a simple armature, but what I'm going to do first thing is get in and start to focus on some of the structure. So I want to make sure that I know where the front plane of his chest is, know how the external oblique is going to flow into that, and a lot of the forms here are going to be very important for this. So I'm using these topology lines to delineate all of this stuff. So for example, right here, I'm imagining that as the iliac crest, and then from there we're going to extend the external obliques, which will come in and insert into the chest, but then also will serve to continue the line of the rib. And then from there, great trochanter, and keep in mind, I am still working with this gesture that we spoke about much earlier in our base mesh segment. Okay, just with move, tweaking some things, flattening the feet, moment's work. The polygroups that zSpheres create are very useful to me as well, very important. So use them. Just going in, starting to see where I can put stuff. The head really needed to be rotated. Its position was just not correct. But at the same time, here in a little bit, I'm going to actually do the edge looping for the head and pull the face out, which is something that I showed earlier as well. And this really just makes things easier when working with the face. So I've isolated this one area, or I'm in the process of isolating it, and then press edge loop, and then start to pull those things out. And now I'm not working with symmetry on in this case at all, and that is because the model is posed. So this is a bit of a different workflow that relates specifically to this kind of start with the z-spheres, pose it in z-spheres, and work from there. But you can also be posing your sculpted mesh and then just re-sculpt the muscles. But I wanted to present a workflow that was very traditional and old school. So as I went through and pulled this all together, I found out that it's not too dissimilar amount of time from sculpting a base mesh and then posing and re-sculpting the muscles. So this kind of worked for me. So there's our face, and then we need to go in and start to put our anatomy in. But as I start to do that, I'm going to discover that I'm getting a little lost in all of these polygons, and that has to do with my main job at this point is establishing structure, and I have to be able to visualize all of that inside of my head and mentally put it together with this shape that I have. But there are several things that we can do to help us put that shape in place, and that we get done by drawing on the model itself, making little anatomical marks, which is what every clay sculptor does. Just take the knife tool and just carve in where your iliac crest is, where the center line of your model is, and stuff like that. So that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to prime this for poly painting. We're going to turn colorize on and go into the color palette and press fill object. And then with RGB on in the shelf, right here, Z-add is off. We don't want that on. And here's the color palette that we were going to earlier. We're just going to go in and make our little notes. So iliac crest, and then our center line. So the rib cage, the flow to the hips, and then the hips. Keeping in mind that the hips are pretty much straight, and that the rib cage is pretty much straight, but that the twist happens here in the torso. It's very useful for me to put the sacrum in there as well and make sure that I know right where that hip is going. Line of the rib. Here I'm using this line right here to make sure everything's correct. So you'll see me occasionally, I end up using this line, I use the edge of the canvas, I use all these places to just kind of help me draw straight lines. Repositioning the butt just a little bit, making sure that the space between each cheek is kind of flowing in the right direction. Little notes for my scapula, which is going to get submerged under a sea of muscles, because this is a Hercules figure we're working with. And then also keeping in mind that it's very important that I get in and I establish the line of the clavicles as it goes back. But then notice how I also put the line of the scapula in there as well. Alright, so I'm going to be toggling colorize on and off. And what I'm doing right now is just kind of separating the rib cage from the hips. A lot of the confusion that we can experience when working with the figurative model is just in the sheer complexity of things that we have to deal with. So if you limit that, your life can be made a lot easier. And so that's what I'm doing, is limiting that right now. I'm focusing on just the hips and just the rib cage. External oblique doesn't exist for me right now. The abdominal muscles don't exist. So I just want to make sure that the pit of the neck, that the rib cage itself, all of that has the correct shape. Here I am looking at the shape of the rib cage itself. So I'm trying to make sure that in terms of the rib cage from, say, a side view, I have just the right gesture for me. So here I'm going to say the pit of the neck is here. That means that the 7th cervical vertebrae's got to come up here. It means that you have to have a front plane. You've got to have a sense of the rib cage coming in this way, and then you've got to have it come back like that. So this area may be a bit too much right now, but overall, this is the direction that we need to be going. So just checking these forms and making sure that they're at least working for us. You really can't spend too much time on this, to be honest, because if you get this wrong, all the muscle that sits on top of it is going to be wrong. And it's a real shame to get there to where you've got all of this muscle sculpted, find out that your underlying form is wrong, and have to try to go in and fix it and even possibly destroy some of it. Here I'm changing the poly group for the arm so that it's going to be easier for me to hide just an individual part. I'm going to also add some of the anatomical parts of it. So we started to put in a suggestion for the lats. Suggestion of the clavicle in there. Really fill that rib cage out. And make sure that it has the correct plane. So you'll see me spending time on this. This Arch of Apollo is good. This is good. We've got a nice sense of it kind of coming back in space. This area here eventually needs to get pushed in more. This area as well. I need to make sure that I have a nice flat plane right here, and that this flat plane has the proper draft back in space to be able to represent really a rib cage. Because then once that shape is done, then I've got to go in and put the pectoral muscles on top of that. So the pectoral muscles are going to come around. They're going to go and connect in with the humerus. They're going to be bordering the clavicle here and basically pulling in this direction. But they need to rest on the actual shape of the rib cage itself. So in order for them to have the correct shape, you really just have to have that rib cage as accurate as possible. Just isolating the hip area a little bit more. It's going to give me a nice, the ability to really get in there and treat the rib and hip as separate objects. flattening out that front part of the rib cage. So let's just go back just a touch on that. And the shape that I'm really trying to represent from the side view, or from the bottom view, is we have our front plane here, then we have another plane off to the side here, and then it's going to come create this, and in general have this shape. So that's what I'm going in right now and doing, is just making sure that this is the way it should be. And notice how I treat it, as blocky as possible. If you can make it blocky and realistic at the same time, then that's what you need to do. What I end up doing with this model is making it a bit too thin. So already I can kind of see that now, that this, for a Hercules, that rib cage is pretty tiny. I'm going to really have to add some volume to that. So that's fine. Later on I'm going to end up doing that before I get too terribly far. Yeah, I realized my contrapposto wasn't quite working, so I just went in and adjusted it. Again, one of the beautiful things of working in the computer is just how much malleability it has. How you can change things, so late in the game. That would be very painful if you were working in real clay. Okay, so now at this point I start to look at the internal areas. So you saw me earlier put in the lumbar column. So that's very important. We've got our spine coming here, moving into our sacrum. We've got our hips, which are tilting in this direction. We have our line of the rib here, flowing down. And then on both sides of that spine, I have the lumbar column. And so it's very important to get those in there, because those are going to be a real pillar for all of the movement back there. And then the external oblique is going to wrap around here and kind of connect in with them. So you can see, definitely very thin dude. Not much of a Hercules. But one of the things I really want to point out here as well is this construction of the scapula and this back region. So I've talked before about how I like to treat this entire region as just one flat plane. But what I did here that was a little bit different was that I built up this spine of the scapula. I built up this area here, but then instead of just worrying about a flat plane, I kind of built it up with this other connecting muscle right back in here, which is going from the scapula over in this direction. So keep these different construction modes in mind, and how you can use these muscles to really help you define the shape in a very loose way, because this is a very loose gestural sketching approach. that I'm taking, and in order to be successful with it, I have to be comfortable with the anatomy that I'm creating. So this is a good example of where I've got to be comfortable with what I'm doing. So see the brachioradialis connecting in here, flowing around. That's very important to keep in mind. And then also how the ulna is going to be, the ulna process is going to be right there on the outside, and this line of the ulna that's going from the elbow and connecting in here. So that means that all of our, actually I should say right back in here. So that means that all of our extenders are going to be connecting in here to the front of the hand, whereas the flexors are going to be in the back. So let's just let that play out. Flattening the hand, so it's going to be a fist. Putting in the flexors back there, and really making sure that the wrist itself is as much of a planar rectangle as possible. So here I'm really realizing that I basically made a young David and not a Hercules. Really beefing him up with the move brush. Okay, starting to look thicker. Arm on the basically his right arm is going to need some help, but we'll get there. That bicep, that brachioradialis in there, flexors, extenders, square off this fist here for his hand. Give his trapezius some weight to it. But one thing I really want to emphasize with this trapezius is that whenever I work with the trapezius, I'm always keeping in mind that the neck is one column. So it is one shape that you have to be mindful of. And it needs to break right there. You need a strong break. Even though the trapezius flows up, that's not going to be the way we want to do it. Instead, we want to treat the column of the neck separately. And then we'll go in and we'll put this round plane for the trapezius, the clavicles, and all of that. We're going to just treat those very separately. Okay, just adjusting the face here. Going to make it a little wider here in a second. And flattening off that plane for the scapula there. So let's speed this up. But I kind of want to take a look at what I'm going to do next here with the leg area. So one thing I always keep in mind with the leg is that the sartorius is coming from the iliac crest, and it is coming down and wrapping around the knee. And in this way, it's really separating out the front leg muscles from the side leg muscles and from the hamstrings in the back. So right now I'm going to go in and just quickly put those in. I'm going to get the suggestion for the sartorius in there and put all of the front leg muscles into play. Put the kneecap in there and just press Alt with clay to create a flat plane. That'll really help me delineate exactly what we're doing there. So you can see how now those shapes that I created before, the cubic structure for the hips and the cylindrical structure for the legs, are all now just getting broken up into smaller subsections. Hamstrings coming around from the back, wrapping around the knee on both sides. So something to keep in mind with the hamstring, we've got one coming in, the tendon then wraps around here. Then on the other side, we have another hamstring, and the tendon is wrapping around on the other side of the knee. And then the calf is going to be in position to kind of insert in between them. Speed this process up. When it comes to the legs, or the feet, I'm keeping these very mechanical in nature and very structured. Back in with this foot. Just going to round this surface, put the lats in there, put a suggestion of the pectoral muscles in there, get the external oblique a little bit better, fill in, make it a bit of a belly in there, get him just really, really, really bulky. So that's what I'm doing right now, is just adding some of that bulk with the clay brush. Later I can go in and do this with the magnify brush. But I'm going to stop this right here and just let the rest of this continue on time lapse. In a separate section, but this gives you kind of a clear idea of how I'm going in and building the form very slowly, and not worrying about topology, not worrying about really anything along those kinds of lines, just getting in, sculpting the form as fast, as loose as possible, putting in my anatomical notes, and adjusting it from there. Something that would be very difficult to do in clay, but is very easy to do in the computer. So it's like you're sketching in digital clay. You're sketching in 3D, so to speak, refining surfaces and getting more and more information in the model as you go. So I hope you enjoyed this part, and check out the time-lapsed version, time-lapsed area.